The sun was setting over the crowded park, casting a warm orange glow over the peaceful crowd gathered for a protest. It wasn't loud or chaotic, just a group of people standing together, holding signs that carried powerful messages against discrimination and hate. Among them stood a woman, calm yet commanding, her presence radiating strength. She didn't wear a uniform, just a simple shirt and jeans, blending into the crowd. To anyone passing by, she was just another protester. But beneath her composed exterior lay a lifetime of discipline, honor, and service. The murmurs of unity and resolve rippled through the group when a sudden disruption silenced everything. A police car screeched to a halt nearby. Out stepped an officer, his face twisted in annoyance. His eyes scanned the group with barely concealed contempt before settling on her. "Hey, you!" His voice cut through the air like a whip. The crowd froze. Her gaze met his, steady and unflinching. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her tone calm but firm. "A problem?" he sneered, taking a step closer. "Yeah, the problem is people like you thinking you can just take over this park without permission. Get out, or I'll make you." She tilted her head slightly, confused. "This is a public space. We're allowed to be here." He didn't listen. Instead, his frustration boiled over, and he took another step toward her. "Don't talk back to me. You don't get to act like you're in charge here," he snapped, his hand moving to rest on his baton. The crowd began murmuring nervously, some recording on their phones. She didn't flinch. "Officer," she began, her voice steady despite the rising tension. "There's no need for this. We're here peacefully. If you have concerns, we can discuss them." "Discuss?" he spat, cutting her off. "You think you're somebody important? Think again." Before she could reply, he did the unthinkable. In one swift motion, he shoved her backward with unnecessary force. The crowd gasped as she stumbled, catching herself just in time to avoid falling. His next move was even more shocking, a sharp kick to her shin, sending her to the ground. The collective gasp of the crowd echoed as she hit the pavement. A mixture of anger and disbelief swept through the onlookers. But it wasn't just the physical blow that struck hardest, it was the humiliation, the blatant disregard for her humanity. For a moment, she stayed there, her hands pressed against the ground, her breath steadying as she processed what had just happened. And then she stood. Slowly. Purposefully. Her eyes locked onto his, no longer calm but burning with an intensity that silenced the crowd. Her voice, low and controlled, sliced through the air, "You have no idea who I am." The officer laughed mockingly, taking a step closer. "I don't care who you think you are. Around here, I'm in charge." But the crowd, emboldened by her resilience, began murmuring louder. Phones were raised, recording everything. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice unshaken despite the sting of pain in her leg. "You've already gone too far." "Yeah. What are you gonna do about it?" he taunted, his arrogance blinding him to the shift in the atmosphere. The crowd was no longer just watching, they were waiting. Waiting for her next move. The woman didn't respond immediately. Instead, she straightened her back, the commanding aura around her growing stronger by the second. And then, without raising her voice, she said the words that sent a ripple of shock through the gathering, "Let me show you." What happened next would leave everyone, including the arrogant officer, stunned. The weight of his actions, the consequences of his ignorance, and the revelation of who she truly was would change everything. But how far would this confrontation go? And what would become of the man who thought he could trample over someone he didn't even bother to understand? Stay with us as we uncover the shocking turn of events that will leave you questioning the very foundation of justice and accountability. You won't want to miss what happens next. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism and discrimination. To our Black viewers, your voices, stories, and lives matter deeply. We are here to share narratives that reflect the fight for justice and highlight the strength and resilience of those who have faced unjust challenges. We hope you enjoy this gripping story, crafted with care and a message that resonates. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button to join us for more impactful tales that inspire and empower. Let's get started. Enjoy the story. It was a warm spring afternoon in the heart of Atlanta, Georgia. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the bustling city streets. The chatter of life was everywhere, traffic humming, children playing, and the distant melody of a street performer's saxophone weaving through the air. Amidst this lively backdrop, Naomi Bennett, a 38-year-old Army captain, walked with purpose. She was dressed in simple, unassuming clothes, jeans, sneakers, and a light jacket. Her braided hair was tied back neatly, revealing a face that carried both strength and grace. Naomi had spent over 15 years serving her country. Her career in the military was marked by discipline, strategy, and an unwavering sense of justice. She had seen the best and worst of humanity, serving in war zones and leading peacekeeping missions. Those experiences shaped her, creating a deep well of resilience and a quiet, commanding presence. But despite her rank and accolades, Naomi had always preferred humility. She didn't wear her uniform outside the base unless necessary, nor did she talk much about her achievements. She believed respect was earned, not demanded. That afternoon, Naomi had decided to join a peaceful protest at Woodridge Park, a local space known for its diverse community events. The gathering wasn't large, maybe 50 people at most, but it was significant. The protest aimed to address police brutality and systemic racism, issues that Naomi understood all too well, both as a black woman and a leader responsible for protecting the freedoms of others. The park was a serene place, with its winding trails, towering oak trees, and a small pond reflecting the golden hues of the setting sun. Protesters had gathered near the open lawn, holding signs that carried powerful messages: equality for all, end police violence, and Black Lives Matter. There was no shouting or aggression, only the quiet unity of a community standing together for change. Naomi's sign, tucked under her arm, simply read, "Justice is a right, not a privilege." Among the crowd was her younger sister, Tasha, a fiery 25-year-old social worker with an infectious energy. Tasha had been the one to invite Naomi to the protest, insisting it was important for her to be there. "Come on, big sis," Tasha had teased earlier that day. "You're always talking about justice and accountability. It's time to walk the walk." Naomi had smiled at her sister's enthusiasm. She admired Tasha's fearless activism, even if her methods were sometimes a bit reckless. For Naomi, her approach to change was more measured, rooted in logic and strategy. But today, she was happy to simply stand beside her sister and support the cause. The protest was calm, almost meditative, until a sharp sound disrupted the peaceful atmosphere. The screeching of tires on asphalt drew everyone's attention. A police cruiser had pulled up abruptly near the park entrance. The man who stepped out of the vehicle was Officer Darren Hayes, a tall, broad-shouldered cop in his early 40s. His uniform was crisp, his belt heavy with the tools of his authority. But his posture and expression were anything but professional. Darren had been with the Atlanta PD for over 15 years, but his record wasn't clean. Complaints of excessive force and discriminatory behavior trailed behind him, though none had ever stuck. Darren carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed he was untouchable. The protest had been reported to the department as a disruption, and Darren, already irritated by his long day, had decided to take matters into his own hands. His eyes scanned the crowd, narrowing when they landed on Naomi and Tasha. Something about their presence seemed to agitate him. Maybe it was their calm defiance or the way Naomi stood with quiet confidence, holding her sign without fear. Darren's jaw tightened, and he began walking toward them. "You!" Darren barked, pointing directly at Naomi. The crowd's murmurs grew quieter as all eyes turned toward the unfolding confrontation. "This is an unauthorized gathering." Pack it up and get out of here. Naomi raised an eyebrow, her voice steady as she replied, "This is a public park, officer. We're exercising our First Amendment rights." Darren's face darkened. "Don't get smart with me. You need a permit for this kind of thing." "We're not obstructing anyone," Naomi countered calmly. "And the city allows peaceful assemblies here." Tasha stepped forward, her fiery personality kicking in. "Why don't you go harass someone else, officer? We're not breaking any laws." Darren's patience snapped. He turned his full attention to Naomi, the quieter of the two sisters, perhaps assuming she would be easier to intimidate. "You think you can just do whatever you want, huh?" he growled, stepping closer. His tone was laced with disdain, his words dripping with unspoken prejudice. "You don't belong here." Naomi's jaw tightened, but she kept her composure. "Officer, we're not here to cause trouble. We're just standing for what we believe in." Darren wasn't interested in reason. "I'm not gonna tell you again," he barked, his voice rising. "Leave. Now." The crowd began recording on their phones, sensing the tension escalating. Tasha tried to step in again, but Naomi gently placed a hand on her sister's arm, signaling her to stay back. "It's fine," Naomi said softly, though her eyes never left Darren's. But Darren wasn't done. Frustrated by Naomi's refusal to back down, he made his move. In a swift, aggressive motion, he shoved her backward. Naomi stumbled, her sign falling to the ground. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Tasha shouted, "What the hell is wrong with you?" Naomi regained her footing, her eyes blazing with restrained fury. "That was unnecessary," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the shocked silence. "Oh, you think you're tough?" Darren sneered. And then, to the horror of everyone watching, he lashed out with his foot, kicking Naomi's shin hard enough to send her collapsing to one knee. The crowd erupted in angry shouts, phones raised higher to capture the brutality. Tasha rushed to her sister's side, her voice trembling with both anger and fear. "Naomi, are you okay?" Naomi didn't respond immediately. She took a deep breath, her hands pressing against the pavement as she steadied herself. When she looked up, her face was no longer calm. It was resolute. "You just made a huge mistake," Naomi said quietly, her words laced with both warning and promise. Darren smirked, oblivious to the storm he had just unleashed. For him, it was just another day of asserting his authority. But for Naomi, this was the moment everything changed. And for everyone watching, it was the beginning of something they would never forget. The atmosphere in Woodridge Park shifted immediately after Naomi's fall. The crowd, once silent and observant, had transformed into a wave of murmurs, indignation, and fury. People were shouting at Officer Darren Hayes, their phones raised to capture every second of what had just occurred. The officer, however, seemed completely unbothered by the chaos around him. He stood tall, his hands resting on his belt, an air of arrogance surrounding him. Naomi slowly rose to her feet, brushing dirt from her knees. Her face was a mask of calm, but anyone who looked closer could see the simmering anger in her eyes. Tasha was beside her, visibly shaking, her hands clenched into fists. "Naomi, let's go," Tasha urged, her voice thick with emotion. "This isn't worth it. He's not worth it." Naomi met her sister's gaze, her expression steady. "He thinks he's above the law, Tasha," she said quietly, her voice measured but resolute. "If we leave now, we let him win." Tasha hesitated, glancing at the officer, whose smug grin only fueled her frustration. "Fine," she muttered. "But don't do anything crazy." Naomi turned to Darren, her posture straight and unyielding. "Officer Hayes," she said, her tone calm but authoritative, "you've assaulted me without cause. I'll be filing a formal complaint." Darren laughed, a low, mocking sound that made the crowd bristle. "Go ahead, lady. File whatever you want. You people are good at that." A ripple of outrage ran through the crowd. Someone shouted, "We saw everything. You're done, man." Another voice added, "Justice is coming for you." Naomi didn't flinch. She kept her eyes locked on Darren's, her voice unwavering. "You've underestimated the consequences of your actions. That was your first mistake." Darren took a step closer, his smirk unwavering. "And what's my second mistake, huh?" he taunted. "Thinking you'd actually do something about it?" The crowd's tension was palpable. Tasha tugged at Naomi's arm, whispering urgently, "Naomi, don't. He's just trying to bait you." But Naomi didn't back down. "You'll find out soon enough," she replied, her words sharp and deliberate. By the time the incident was over, news of what had happened had already begun spreading. Videos of the altercation were shared across social media platforms, gaining traction at an astonishing rate. People were outraged, their comments filled with demands for accountability and justice. Naomi spent the rest of the evening drafting her complaint. She included every detail she could remember, her military precision guiding her as she outlined the events. She sent the document to her lawyer, an old friend who had fought alongside her during a deployment years ago. He promised to escalate the issue immediately. The next morning, Naomi received a call from her commanding officer, Colonel Raymond Pierce. His deep, steady voice carried a mix of concern and curiosity. "Captain Bennett," he began, "I've been made aware of the incident at Woodridge Park. It seems your actions, or rather, the actions taken against you, have attracted significant attention." Naomi sighed, running a hand over her braided hair. "Yes, sir. I didn't anticipate things escalating the way they did." "Neither did I," Pierce admitted. "But the footage is everywhere. The department's reputation is at stake. Are you prepared for the fallout?" Naomi straightened, her resolve hardening. "Yes, sir. I won't stand down." Pierce paused, then said, "Good. We'll support you however we can. But tread carefully, Bennett. This is bigger than just you and Officer Hayes." Naomi ended the call with a sense of both reassurance and unease. She knew her actions could have wider implications, but she wasn't one to shy away from a fight when principles were at stake. Meanwhile, Darren Hayes sat in his precinct office, scrolling through his phone. The videos of the altercation had reached him, and though he was annoyed by the backlash, he didn't take it seriously. His supervisor, Lieutenant Mark Givens, entered the room with a stern expression. "Darren, we need to talk," Givens said, shutting the door behind him. Darren leaned back in his chair, feigning nonchalance. "What about?" Givens threw a printout of a social media post onto the desk. "This. Your behavior is all over the internet. The chief is breathing down my neck." Darren shrugged. "Let them talk. Nothing's gonna come of it." "You don't get it," Givens snapped. "That woman you pushed around isn't just some random civilian. She's an army captain with connections. You've stirred up a hornet's nest." Darren's smirk faltered slightly. "An army captain," he repeated, his tone less certain. "Yes, and she's already filed a formal complaint. There's an internal investigation being launched as we speak." Darren frowned, his confidence wavering. "So what? They won't find anything. It's my word against hers." Givens leaned closer, his voice low and warning. "You'd better hope that's enough, because if they do find something, you're done." The tension between Naomi and Darren grew as the days passed. The public outcry continued to build, with protests outside the police precinct and demands for Darren's suspension. Naomi remained composed, attending meetings with her lawyer and speaking with journalists who wanted her side of the story. One evening, Tasha burst into Naomi's apartment, her face flushed with excitement. "You're not gonna believe this," she exclaimed, holding up her phone. "They're digging into his past. Turns out he's got a whole history of complaints, excessive force, racial profiling, the works." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "And And, Tasha continued, the department buried them all. But now, with your case, they're being forced to reopen them. Naomi's expression remained neutral, but there was a flicker of satisfaction in her eyes. Good. It's about time. Tasha sat beside her, her energy contagious. This is huge, Naomi. He's finally being held accountable. Naomi nodded slowly. It's not over yet. He still thinks he's untouchable. Not for long, Tasha said firmly. Darren, meanwhile, was beginning to feel the pressure. His once confident demeanor had been replaced with irritation and paranoia. He knew the walls were closing in, but he refused to admit defeat. He doubled down, defending his actions in internal meetings and brushing off the criticism as overblown. But as more information about his past came to light, even his colleagues began to distance themselves. Darren's world, once so secure and impenetrable, was starting to crumble. Naomi, on the other hand, remained steadfast. She knew the battle wasn't just about her, it was about everyone who had ever faced the kind of injustice she had. She was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. As the stage was set for the final confrontation, the tension reached a boiling point. The truth was on the verge of being revealed, and the consequences would be irreversible. All eyes were on Naomi and Darren, waiting to see who would come out on top. The question wasn't just about justice, it was about what happens when someone finally meets their reckoning. The courtroom was packed, the air tense with anticipation. Reporters lined the back, cameras flashing occasionally despite the strict warnings to keep proceedings private. The case against Officer Darren Hayes had grown into a citywide spectacle. What had started as a single incident in Woodridge Park had unraveled into a full-blown investigation exposing years of unchecked misconduct. Naomi sat at the plaintiff's table, her posture straight, her face calm but serious. Beside her, her lawyer, Marcus Langston, reviewed the last-minute notes. His presence was a steadying one, his deep, reassuring voice guiding her through every twist and turn of the case. Remember, Marcus murmured, leaning closer, stick to the facts. You've already won the public's trust. Today is about cementing the truth. Naomi nodded, her eyes scanning the room. Across the aisle, Darren sat with his defense attorney. His face was a mask of defiance, but there was an underlying unease in his posture. His once smug confidence had been steadily eroded as evidence against him piled up. The damning footage, the reopened complaints, the public backlash, it all pointed to one conclusion. But Darren still clung to the belief that he could weather the storm. The judge entered, and the courtroom fell silent. Proceedings began, with the prosecutor laying out a meticulous timeline of Darren's actions, not just during the Woodridge Park incident but throughout his career. Witnesses were called, each one painting a clearer picture of a man who had abused his power time and time again. Finally, it was Naomi's turn to testify. She took a deep breath as she stood, her heels clicking softly against the floor as she approached the stand. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on her. This wasn't just about her, it was about everyone who had been silenced, ignored, or dismissed. The prosecutor began with straightforward questions. Naomi recounted the events of that day with precision, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. She described the push, the kick, the humiliation. The prosecutor's questions were designed to emphasize her credibility, and she answered them with the calm authority of someone used to high-pressure situations. When it was time for Darren's defense attorney to cross-examine, the room seemed to hold its breath. The attorney, a sharp-eyed man with a no-nonsense demeanor, approached the stand. Captain Bennett, he began, his tone measured, you've testified that Officer Hayes's actions were unprovoked. But wouldn't you agree that a public protest can sometimes escalate tensions? Naomi met his gaze evenly. A peaceful protest shouldn't escalate tensions unless someone chooses to escalate them. The attorney raised an eyebrow. You say peaceful, but isn't it true that your sister, Miss Tasha Bennett, was confrontational with Officer Hayes? Naomi's lips pressed into a thin line. My sister spoke up against an injustice. Words are not a justification for violence. The attorney didn't flinch. And yet, you admit that tensions were high. Isn't it possible that Officer Hayes perceived a threat? Naomi leaned forward slightly, her voice firm. I was holding a sign, not a weapon. The only threat Officer Hayes perceived was my refusal to be intimidated. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. The defense attorney seemed momentarily thrown but recovered quickly. Captain Bennett, he continued, you've served in the military for over 15 years. Would you describe yourself as disciplined? Yes, Naomi replied without hesitation. And would you agree that discipline sometimes requires understanding authority? Naomi's eyes narrowed slightly. It requires understanding when authority is legitimate and when it's being abused. The attorney hesitated, sensing the trap in her words. He shifted tactics. Let's talk about your reaction after the incident. You filed a complaint, correct? Yes. And you knew that filing this complaint could potentially ruin Officer Hayes's career? Naomi's jaw tightened. I knew it could hold him accountable. The attorney's voice sharpened. Or was it retaliation? A tense silence filled the room. Naomi didn't blink. It was justice. As Naomi stepped down from the stand, Darren's demeanor grew increasingly agitated. He could feel the walls closing in. When the defense called him to testify, the shift in the room was palpable. His arrogance had been replaced with a defensive edge, his tone curt as he answered questions. The prosecutor wasted no time. Officer Hayes, can you explain why you felt the need to physically push Captain Bennett? Darren folded his arms. She was being uncooperative. Uncooperative? The prosecutor's voice was incredulous. She asked you to clarify the basis for your actions. How is that uncooperative? Darren's jaw worked, his frustration evident. She was challenging my authority. And you believe that justifies physical force? I did what I thought was necessary to control the situation. The prosecutor stepped closer, her voice rising. Control the situation? Or control her? Darren's face darkened, but he didn't respond. The prosecutor pressed on. Is it true, Officer Hayes, that you've had multiple complaints filed against you for similar behavior? They were unfounded, Darren snapped. Unfounded? The prosecutor turned to the jury. 11 complaints, all buried by the department, yet all with eerily similar patterns. Excessive force. Racial profiling. And now, with the entire country watching, you expect us to believe this was just a misunderstanding? Darren's composure cracked. I've done my job for over 15 years. People don't understand what it's like out there, how hard it is. The prosecutor's voice softened, her tone almost pitying. Maybe it's not the job that's hard, Officer Hayes. Maybe it's you. As the trial drew to a close, the tension in the room was electric. Both sides made their closing arguments, each presenting their case with passion and precision. But it was Naomi's quiet strength and Darren's unraveling facade that lingered in the minds of the jury. The judge adjourned, and everyone filed out, the weight of the impending verdict hanging over them. Naomi stood in the hallway, her hands clasped tightly together as she watched Darren walk past, his expression unreadable. You did well, Marcus said softly beside her. Now we wait. Naomi nodded, her eyes never leaving Darren. Whatever happens next, she murmured, it's out of my hands. But deep down, she knew this was far from over. Darren Hayes had spent years evading accountability, but now, the cracks in his armor were finally showing. And when those cracks gave way, the impact would be felt far beyond the walls of that courtroom. The courtroom buzzed with tension as everyone filed back in for the reading of the verdict. The jury had been out for hours, deliberating the fate of Officer Darren Hayes. For Naomi, those hours had been both a blur and an eternity. She sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Across the room, Darren sat with his attorney, his expression hardened into a mask of stoicism, though the tension in his jaw betrayed his nerves. Marcus leaned toward Naomi, his voice low. "No matter what happens, you've already made an impact. The truth is out there, and people are listening." Naomi nodded, her face calm but her heart racing. "It's not just about me, Marcus," she whispered. "It's about everyone he's hurt. This needs to mean something." Before Marcus could respond, the bailiff called for silence, and the judge re-entered the room. The murmurs ceased instantly, replaced by a palpable stillness as the jury was led back in. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with a stern but fair demeanor, held the small slip of paper containing the verdict. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked, her voice steady but firm. "We have, Your Honor," the foreperson replied, her words cutting through the silence. The room seemed to hold its collective breath as the paper was handed to the judge. She scanned the words carefully before nodding and handing it back to the foreperson. The foreperson stood, clearing her throat. "In the matter of Bennett versus Hayes, we find the defendant, Officer Darren Hayes, guilty of misconduct and abuse of power." The room erupted into a mix of gasps and murmurs. Darren's face turned pale, his jaw clenching as he stared straight ahead. Naomi exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. For a moment, the weight of the decision settled over her, a sense of vindication and relief mingling with the heavy reality of what it all meant. Darren's defense attorney rose immediately, addressing the judge. "Your Honor, we'd like to file a motion for appeal." The judge raised her hand, cutting him off. "The court will hear any motions at the appropriate time. For now, sentencing will proceed." Naomi glanced at Marcus, who gave her a small, reassuring nod. She wasn't naive, she knew this wasn't the end. Appeals would be filed, arguments would continue, but for now, a significant victory had been won. Justice had taken its first step forward. As the courtroom emptied, Naomi found herself lingering near the hallway. The adrenaline of the moment hadn't worn off, and her mind raced with thoughts of what this decision would mean, not just for her but for the broader fight against systemic injustice. Darren emerged moments later, his attorney by his side, speaking in hushed but urgent tones. His expression was a volatile mix of anger and fear. Spotting Naomi, he hesitated, then, to everyone's surprise, approached her. "Captain Bennett," he began, his voice low and strained. "I hope you're happy. You've ruined my career." Naomi turned to face him fully, her expression unreadable. "I didn't ruin your career, Officer Hayes. You did that yourself." His jaw tightened. "You don't understand what it's like to be in my position." "And you don't understand what it's like to be in mine," Naomi replied evenly. "To walk into every room knowing people have already decided what you're worth. To see someone like you abuse the power you were trusted with and think you can get away with it." Darren opened his mouth to respond, but Naomi held up a hand. "Save it. This isn't about me versus you anymore. This is about accountability, something you've been avoiding your whole life." For a moment, Darren seemed to struggle for words. Finally, he muttered, "You think you're better than me?" Naomi's voice softened, though her resolve remained firm. "No, Officer Hayes. I think we both know that being better isn't the point. The point is that you failed to live up to what you were supposed to be. And now, you're facing the consequences." Darren looked away, his face a mask of frustration and shame. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his attorney trailing behind him. Later that evening, Naomi returned home to find Tasha waiting for her. The younger woman was pacing the living room, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. "Tasha," Naomi began, her voice tired but calm. "What are you doing here? Have you seen this?" Tasha demanded, holding up her phone. A video was playing, a clip from the trial, specifically Naomi's testimony. It had been shared across social media, accompanied by hashtags calling for broader reform and justice. Naomi sighed, sinking into the couch. I guess it's out there now. Out there. Naomi, you're everywhere. People are talking about what you said, what you stood for. This is bigger than just that courtroom. Naomi rested her head against the back of the couch, closing her eyes for a moment. I didn't do this to become a symbol, Tasha. I just wanted to do the right thing. And you did, Tasha said firmly, sitting beside her. But now, people are looking to you. They see you as someone who stood up when it mattered. Naomi opened her eyes, meeting her sister's gaze. That's a lot of pressure. Tasha smiled, her voice softening. Yeah, but if anyone can handle it, it's you. Meanwhile, Darren sat alone in his apartment, the echoes of the courtroom still ringing in his ears. His phone buzzed incessantly with messages and calls, some supportive, most condemning. He stared at the pile of paperwork on his desk, the appeal process outlined in excruciating detail. For the first time in his life, Darren felt the weight of his actions in a way he couldn't ignore. The safety net of institutional protection had been pulled out from under him, and now, he was left to face the consequences alone. He picked up his phone, scrolling through the messages until he found one from an old colleague. The words were simple but cut deep, "You had this coming." Darren threw the phone onto the couch, burying his head in his hands. The cracks in his facade had finally given way, and now he was left to reckon with the man he had become. Back in her quiet apartment, Naomi sat on her balcony, the cool evening air brushing against her skin. She stared out at the city lights, her mind racing with thoughts of the day's events. She didn't feel victorious, not entirely. The fight wasn't over, and she knew there was still so much work to be done. But as she sat there, Tasha joined her, handing her a mug of tea. You did good today, Tasha said softly, sitting beside her. Naomi nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. We did good. The sisters sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything they had been through settling between them. Naomi knew the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope. And she knew, deep down, that this was just the beginning. The fallout from the trial sent shockwaves across the city. News outlets covered the case relentlessly, dissecting every moment, every piece of testimony, and every word spoken in the courtroom. Social media erupted with debates, celebrations, and outrage, depending on who was speaking. The hashtag Justice for Naomi trended for days, bringing national attention to a case that had started in the quiet corners of Woodridge Park. Naomi had barely slept since the verdict. Every time she closed her eyes, her mind replayed the moments in the courtroom, the stinging words of the defense, the stares of the jury, and Darren's bitter final look before he left. Her phone had been ringing non-stop, friends, reporters, activists, and strangers from across the country wanting to speak with her. She felt a growing sense of responsibility, knowing that her story had become a rallying cry for so many people. Late one night, Naomi sat in her living room with Marcus, papers spread across the coffee table. He was walking her through the next steps, civil actions, potential public appearances, and strategies for managing the newfound attention. Tasha lounged on the couch nearby, scrolling through her phone. This isn't going to quiet down anytime soon, Marcus said, leaning back in his chair. The momentum is strong. People are looking to you as a symbol of accountability. Naomi rubbed her temples, exhaustion evident in her posture. I didn't ask to be a symbol, she said quietly. I just wanted to stand up for what was right. I know, Marcus replied. But you've become one. The question is, what do you want to do with that? Naomi looked up at him, her eyes heavy with thought. I don't want this to just be about me and Darren Hayes. This has to mean something bigger. Otherwise, it's just another headline. Tasha chimed in from the couch, not looking up from her phone. Well, people are definitely listening. I just saw a clip of your testimony hit 1 million views. The comments are, mostly supportive. Naomi sighed. Mostly? Tasha hesitated. There are a few trolls, but that's expected. The important thing is, you're making people think. Marcus leaned forward, his tone encouraging. Naomi, this is an opportunity to push for real change. Policy reform. Better oversight. You have a voice people are listening to right now. You can use it. Naomi nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling over her. I'll think about it. Meanwhile, Darren Hayes was grappling with a very different reality. His life had unraveled in ways he hadn't anticipated. The verdict had not only stripped him of his job but also marked him publicly as a symbol of corruption and abuse. His appeal process was moving forward, but the chances of overturning the decision were slim, and he knew it. Darren had become a pariah. Former colleagues avoided him, friends distanced themselves, and even his family was struggling to reconcile the man they knew with the one the world now saw. His once comfortable life was now mired in uncertainty and isolation. One evening, Darren sat alone in his small apartment, staring at the stack of unopened letters on his kitchen counter. Most were bills, but a few were from advocacy groups demanding accountability, their words scathing and direct. He felt the walls closing in on him, his thoughts racing as he tried to make sense of how things had come to this. The sound of his phone buzzing broke the silence. He glanced at the screen, it was his sister, Vanessa. With a heavy sigh, he picked up. Darren, Vanessa's voice was tense but concerned. Are you okay? Darren leaned against the counter, rubbing his eyes. What do you think? There was a pause on the other end. I think you've made mistakes, Darren. Big ones. But shutting yourself off from everyone isn't going to fix anything. What am I supposed to do? Darren snapped. Everyone's turned against me. I can't even walk down the street without people glaring at me. You brought this on yourself, Vanessa said, her tone firm. But that doesn't mean it's too late to make things right. Darren scoffed. Right? What's that supposed to mean? It means taking responsibility. Apologizing. Doing something to show you've learned from this. Darren shook his head, frustration boiling over. People don't want an apology. They want someone to blame. Vanessa's voice softened. Maybe. But you can't live the rest of your life hiding from what you've done. You have to face it. Darren didn't respond, his thoughts too tangled to form words. Vanessa's words hung in the air long after the call ended. Days turned into weeks, and the ripple effects of the trial continued to spread. Activist groups rallied around Naomi, inviting her to speak at events and lead discussions on reform. At first, she was hesitant, unsure if she was ready for such a public role. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized she couldn't ignore the opportunity to make a difference. One evening, Naomi stood backstage at a town hall event, her hands gripping the edges of the podium she was about to carry onto the stage. The crowd outside was large, their voices humming with anticipation. Tasha stood beside her, offering a reassuring smile. You've got this, Tasha said. Just speak from the heart. Naomi nodded, her nerves steadying as she took a deep breath. It's not about me, she said softly. It's about the message. When Naomi stepped onto the stage, the applause was deafening. She took her place at the microphone, scanning the sea of faces before her. The weight of their expectations settled on her shoulders, but she didn't falter. Good evening, she began, her voice strong and clear. I stand here today not as a hero or a victim but as someone who believes in accountability. What happened in that courtroom wasn't just about one officer or one incident. It was about a system that has allowed too many people to fall through the cracks. The crowd erupted into cheers, but Naomi raised a hand, silencing them gently. Change doesn't happen overnight. It happens because people like you and me refuse to stay silent. It happens because we demand better, not just for ourselves but for the generations that come after us. Her words carried a weight that resonated deeply, and as she continued, the crowd hung on every syllable. Naomi spoke of justice, resilience, and the power of standing together. She knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but in that moment, she felt a spark of hope. Across town, Darren watched the event unfold on his television. He sat in the dim light of his apartment, his face illuminated by the screen. Naomi's words hit him harder than he expected, her message of accountability striking a chord he hadn't been ready to confront. For the first time in weeks, Darren felt something shift inside him, a flicker of understanding, a recognition of the man he had become. He didn't know what to do with it yet, but he knew one thing: he couldn't keep running from the truth. The path forward was uncertain, but it was a path he would have to choose carefully. The question was whether he would take it, or let the weight of his past drag him down for good. The days following Naomi's speech were a whirlwind. Invitations poured in from organizations across the country, each wanting her voice to amplify their cause. She spent her mornings fielding calls with Marcus and her evenings reflecting on the weight of it all. Despite her composed exterior, the whirlwind of attention felt both empowering and suffocating. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was representing countless others who had faced injustice. One night, Naomi found herself sitting on her balcony, a cup of tea in her hands. Tasha joined her, pulling a blanket around her shoulders as the cool night breeze swept through. "You've been quiet," Tasha said gently, studying her sister's face. Naomi sighed, staring at the city lights in the distance. "It's a lot to process. I wanted justice, Tasha. Not fame. Now it feels like I'm carrying everyone's expectations." Tasha leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. "You're not carrying them alone, Naomi. People are behind you because they see you as someone who's not afraid to stand up. You've inspired them." Naomi turned to her sister, her expression thoughtful. "But what if I let them down? What if I make a mistake?" Tasha's gaze softened. "You're human. Mistakes will happen. What matters is that you keep moving forward. You've already shown people what strength looks like. That's enough." Naomi smiled faintly, the weight on her shoulders feeling just a little lighter. "Thanks, Tasha. I don't say it enough, but I couldn't have done this without you." Tasha grinned. "You're welcome. Now, finish that tea and get some sleep. You've got a meeting with the mayor tomorrow, and you don't want to show up looking like a zombie." Naomi chuckled, the sound warm and genuine. "Yes, ma'am." Across the city, Darren was facing a far different reality. The weight of the trial and its aftermath had pushed him into a deep state of introspection. The once proud officer now spent his days avoiding the outside world, drowning in his own thoughts. Late one evening, Darren sat at his kitchen table, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in front of him. The room was dimly lit, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound breaking the silence. His phone buzzed on the counter, but he ignored it. He already knew who it was, his sister, Vanessa, checking in on him for the 5th time that day. He poured another drink, his hand trembling slightly. The events of the past weeks played over and over in his mind. Naomi's testimony, the judge's stern words, the looks of disappointment from his colleagues, it was a loop he couldn't escape. Finally, his phone buzzed again, this time with a message. He glanced at the screen, expecting another plea from Vanessa. But the name that popped up made him freeze, Marcus Langston. For a moment, Darren stared at the screen, his heart pounding. He hadn't expected Naomi's lawyer to reach out, and his mind raced with possibilities. With a shaky hand, he unlocked the phone and opened the message. "Officer Hayes, I'm reaching out on behalf of Captain Bennett. She has requested a private meeting with you to discuss the case and its aftermath. Please let me know if you're open to this. M. Langston." Darren read the message twice, disbelief washing over him. Why would Naomi want to meet with him after everything that had happened? He wrestled with his emotions, anger, guilt, and a flicker of curiosity. After a long pause, he typed a brief response. "I'll think about it." 2 days later, Darren found himself sitting in a small, neutral office space arranged by Marcus. The walls were plain, the furnishing sparse, designed to keep things professional and focused. He sat stiffly in his chair, his hands resting on the table as he waited. The door opened, and Naomi walked in, her expression calm but unreadable. She was dressed simply, her demeanor composed yet authoritative. Darren rose awkwardly, unsure whether to extend his hand or remain seated. Naomi spared him the decision by nodding curtly before taking a seat across from him. "Thank you for coming," Naomi began, her voice steady but cool. Darren shifted uncomfortably. "I wasn't sure if I should," he admitted. "But I guess I wanted to hear what you had to say." Naomi studied him for a moment, her gaze piercing. "I didn't ask for this meeting to rehash the trial. That's done. What I want to know is whether you've truly thought about what happened, and why it happened." Darren frowned, his defenses immediately rising. "I've thought about it, all right. Every single day since the trial. But if you're here to lecture me, I'm not here to lecture you," Naomi interrupted, her tone sharp but controlled. "I'm here because I want to understand how someone in your position could justify what you did. Was it arrogance? Prejudice? Or were you just so used to getting away with it that you stopped caring?" Darren flinched at her words, his jaw tightening. "You don't know what it's like to be a cop. To deal with the stress, the pressure. It messes with your head." Naomi's eyes narrowed. "And you think that justifies assaulting an unarmed woman? Kicking her while she's on the ground? Don't hide behind your badge, Darren. Own up to what you did." The room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of Naomi's words hanging between them. Darren looked down at his hands, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't thinking. I was angry. Frustrated. And I took it out on you." Naomi leaned forward slightly, her voice softening but remaining firm. "Do you even understand the damage you've caused? Not just to me, but to the people who trusted you to protect them? The people who now see you as a symbol of everything that's wrong with the system?" Darren swallowed hard, his guilt finally breaking through his defenses. I didn't see it that way. Not until now." Naomi's expression remained steady, though there was a flicker of something softer in her eyes. "Acknowledging it is the first step. But it's not enough. What are you going to do to make it right?" Darren looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mix of shame and determination. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I want to try." Naomi nodded slowly, her voice firm but not unkind. "Then start by listening. To the people you hurt. To the voices you ignored. And don't just listen, act." For the first time, Darren felt a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in weeks, hope. It was fragile, uncertain, but it was there. And as he left the room that day, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of a path he hadn't known he needed to take. Naomi watched him go, her thoughts swirling. She didn't know if Darren would follow through on his words, but she knew one thing for certain: the fight for justice didn't end in the courtroom. It was a continuous battle, one that required both courage and accountability. And she was ready to keep fighting. The following weeks were a whirlwind of change, reflection, and, for some, redemption. The trial's impact continued to ripple outward, sparking debates in city council meetings, igniting protests in other communities, and even leading to the resignation of a senior officer in Darren's former precinct who had been accused of covering up past misconduct. Naomi's name remained a powerful symbol in these discussions, but she refused to let herself be defined by a single moment. She was already looking forward, to solutions, to reform, to meaningful action. One afternoon, Naomi sat in a brightly lit community center, surrounded by activists, local leaders, and citizens. The meeting was a brainstorming session for new accountability policies within the police department. Marcus was beside her, occasionally leaning over to offer insights or take notes. Tasha, ever the energetic presence, stood near the front, leading the discussion. The key, Tasha said passionately, is transparency. Body cameras can't just be for show. They need to be reviewed regularly, not just when something goes wrong. A middle-aged man in the audience raised his hand. But how do we ensure that complaints don't just disappear? It's not just about cameras, it's about trust. Naomi spoke up, her voice calm but firm. Accountability starts at the top. Supervisors need to be held responsible for their officers' actions. And there needs to be an independent oversight committee to review complaints. The room murmured in agreement, and Tasha nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. We need people who aren't tied to the department making these decisions. That's the only way to restore faith in the system. As the meeting progressed, Naomi couldn't help but notice the diverse group gathered around her. People of all ages and backgrounds had come together to push for change. It was a reminder that while the fight was far from over, they were not alone. Across town, Darren sat in a small office at a local nonprofit organization. After weeks of soul-searching, he had reached out to one of the advocacy groups that had been critical of him during the trial. To his surprise, they had agreed to meet with him, and now he found himself face-to-face with their director, a woman named Lorraine Porter. Lorraine was a formidable presence, sharp-eyed, with an air of authority that demanded respect. She leaned back in her chair, studying Darren with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. "So," Lorraine began, her tone measured, "you say you want to help. Why should I believe you?" Darren hesitated, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "Because I need to make this right. I know I've done harm, and I can't undo that. But I want to do something to fix it." Lorraine raised an eyebrow. "Fix it? You think volunteering at a few events or writing a check is going to erase what you've done?" Darren shook his head. "No. I know it's not that simple. I don't expect forgiveness or redemption. I need to be part of the solution. I need to understand what I didn't before." Lorraine's gaze softened slightly, though her voice remained firm. "Understanding is a start. But actions speak louder than words. If you're serious about this, you'll need to prove it." "I will," Darren said quietly. "Just tell me how." Lorraine leaned forward, her expression intense. "We're organizing a series of community listening sessions. People who've been affected by police misconduct will be sharing their stories. If you're serious, you'll come. Not to defend yourself, not to speak, but to listen." Darren nodded, his stomach tightening at the thought. "I'll be there." Lorraine studied him for a long moment before finally saying, "Good. Let's see if you mean it." A week later, Darren found himself sitting in a circle of chairs in a community center. The room was filled with a mix of faces, some weary, some angry, some cautiously hopeful. This was one of the listening sessions Lorraine had mentioned, and Darren felt the weight of every gaze that flicked toward him. Lorraine stood at the front of the room, her voice steady as she introduced the session. "We're here today to share experiences, to speak truth, and to begin the work of healing. This is a safe space for honesty, and I ask everyone here to respect that." As the session began, one by one, people shared their stories. A young mother spoke about how her teenage son had been harassed by officers for years. An elderly man recounted a night decades ago when he had been pulled over for, fitting a description, and had spent hours in a holding cell without cause. Each story was a reminder of the systemic issues that had plagued the community for generations. Darren listened intently, his heart heavy with guilt. He could see the pain in their faces, hear the anger and frustration in their voices. For the first time, he began to understand the full scope of what he had been a part of. Toward the end of the session, a woman named Carol spoke up. She was in her late 30s, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've spent years trying to explain to my kids why they have to be extra careful around police. Why they can't make a wrong move, even if they're in the right. It's exhausting, and it's unfair. And I'm tired of feeling like we're asking for too much just by wanting to feel safe." Her words hit Darren like a punch to the gut. He thought of all the times he had dismissed complaints like hers, chalking them up to exaggeration or misunderstanding. Now, sitting in this room, he couldn't deny the reality staring him in the face. When the session ended, Darren lingered, unsure if he should approach anyone. Lorraine walked over, her expression unreadable. "Well?" she asked. Darren took a deep breath. "It's hard to hear. But I needed to." Lorraine nodded. "Good. Now let's see what you do with what you've learned." Meanwhile, Naomi continued her work, balancing her newfound public role with her personal life. She knew the fight for reform was a long one, but she also knew she couldn't do it alone. She leaned on Tasha, Marcus, and the growing network of supporters who believed in her vision. One evening, Naomi received an unexpected message from Lorraine. It was short but intriguing: "You should come to our next session. There's someone you'll want to see." Curiosity piqued, Naomi agreed. When she arrived at the community center, she was surprised to see Darren sitting among the participants. He looked different, more subdued, less guarded. Lorraine greeted Naomi with a knowing smile. "I thought you'd want to see this for yourself," Lorraine said quietly. As the session began, Naomi watched Darren carefully. He didn't speak, didn't interrupt. He simply listened, his expression a mixture of regret and resolve. For the first time, she saw a man who was trying, not to absolve himself, but to understand. After the session, Naomi approached Darren. He looked up, surprised but not defensive. "Captain Bennett," he said, standing awkwardly. "I didn't expect to see you here." Naomi crossed her arms, her gaze steady. "I didn't expect to see you here either. But I'm glad you came." Darren nodded, his voice quiet. "I have a lot to learn." Naomi studied him for a moment before replying, "We all do. The question is, what are you going to do with what you've learned?" Darren didn't have an answer yet, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. And as Naomi turned to leave, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, change was possible. For both of them. For everyone. The first tangible ripples of change. The police department implemented a new oversight committee, composed of civilians, activists, and legal experts, ensuring greater accountability for officers. Public forums were established, allowing citizens to voice their concerns and experiences without fear of being silenced. These were just the first steps, but they were meaningful ones. Naomi had stepped into a role she never imagined for herself. She had become a prominent voice in the fight for justice and reform, balancing her military duties with her advocacy work. One morning, as she walked through the halls of the local VA hospital where she had volunteered to speak, a young soldier approached her hesitantly. "Captain Bennett?" he asked, his voice filled with awe. "Yes." Naomi replied with a warm but curious smile. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said, his words tumbling out quickly. "Not just for your service, but for standing up in a way most of us are too scared to. You've given people like me hope that things can actually change." Naomi felt a swell of emotion as she nodded. "Thank you. It means a lot to hear that. But remember, change doesn't come from one person, it comes from all of us working together." The young soldier smiled, and Naomi walked away feeling both humbled and invigorated. Her path had been challenging, but knowing she had inspired others made every struggle worth it. For Darren, life had taken a quieter turn. He had resigned himself to a simple job as a delivery driver, far removed from his days in uniform. But he no longer saw this as a punishment. The listening sessions had become a regular part of his routine, and though he was no longer in law enforcement, he had found a new purpose in advocating for the same reforms he had once resisted. One day, after a session, Lorraine approached him with a rare smile. "You've come a long way," she said. "But the real test is what you do next." Darren nodded, his face serious but determined. "I want to keep helping. Not to fix my image, but because it's the right thing to do. Lorraine nodded, her respect for him genuine but cautious. Then keep showing up. People will judge you by your actions, not your words. And so he did. Darren became a consistent presence at community meetings, using his experience to push for changes within the system he had once upheld. He knew redemption wouldn't come easily, and he didn't expect to ever fully erase the damage he had done. But for the first time, he felt like he was contributing to something larger than himself. One sunny afternoon, Naomi and Tasha sat together in Woodridge Park, the same place where everything had begun. The park was lively, filled with families, joggers, and children laughing as they chased one another across the open field. It was a scene of peace and normalcy, yet it carried so much meaning. "It's strange," Naomi said, her eyes scanning the park. "Sitting here, thinking about how different things are now." Tasha leaned back on the bench, her face thoughtful. "It's not perfect, but it's better. And a lot of that is because of you." Naomi shook her head gently. "It's because of us. You were the one who pushed me to speak up. Without you, I might have walked away." Tasha grinned. "I guess we make a good team." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the world move around them. Naomi felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. The fight was far from over, but for now, she allowed herself to enjoy the quiet victory. As the story concludes, let's take a moment to reflect on what it means to confront injustice. Naomi's journey reminds us of the strength it takes to stand up, even when the odds seem insurmountable. Darren's path shows that accountability, while painful, is the first step toward meaningful change. Together, their stories highlight the power of listening, learning, and taking action. What would you do if faced with such challenges? Would you have the courage to speak out like Naomi, or the humility to confront your mistakes like Darren? Share your thoughts in the comments below, your perspective matters. Thank you for joining us for this powerful tale. If you enjoyed the story, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe to Tales of Twist for more impactful narratives that challenge, inspire, and leave you thinking long after they're over. See you in the next story.